So here's where the storytelling comes in. I'll introduce you to the Japanese. Now, the Japanese had gone through a very bloody period. In their language, they call it Sengoku. It translates to the warring states. But the Japanese had gone through this brutal period of civil war when finally one of the great samurai lords, Tokugawa Ieyasu, unifies the country. Politically, he conquers all of the other rebel samurai, brings them under his wing, creates a single government with himself at the top. And this is going on in let me check, the year 1600. Now, after that, Tokugawa decides that, well, I have a very unstable regime. This country has been through a hell of a lot lately, and I've already had problems with outside meddling. Because during the warring states, Catholic missionaries came in, spread their religion, tried to essentially subvert the government by promoting rebellions by the peasants, and Tokugawa ended up having to just obliterate the Catholic religion entirely from his country. And so, what he decides is that the best thing he can do, at least for his dynasty, is he's going to ban outside influence. Nobody leaves the country unless it's on like explicit state business. If you leave, you don't come back. And you don't come in the country either. People who get shipwrecked, like European sailors, are going to be executed if they wash up on their shores. And the only trade that they're going to consider will all be done through one port, Nagasaki. Yes, the same one that was later made famous for being nuked. All trade in the country is going to go through a little trading post at Nagasaki, and they won't even be allowed to go into town. It is walled off. We don't want the dirty, smelly white barbarians on our soil. And Japan effectively shuts itself off from the world. They call this policy sakoku, or closed country. And what's remarkable is that over the next 100 years, the Japanese actually begin to technologically regress. So, for example, during the warring states, the Japanese have been introduced to the firearm, to the musket, matchlock, by the same Portuguese merchants who were importing Catholicism. The Japanese love the matchlock. The whole point of the matchlock is that it's capable of punching through armor. That's the point of a gun in general. When guns are invented, they're inferior to bows in most respects, but even if their accuracy is poor and the reload time is, very high, they're able to punch a hole through armor that an arrow could never get through. They exist essentially to kill knights. Kind of like a bazooka exists to kill tanks. But one problem they had during the warring states was that Buddhist radicals got hold of guns, started to arm the public, and they began this essentially kind of pseudo-republican Buddhist revolt. They didn't exactly want to get rid of the emperor, but they wanted to get rid of the samurai and create a much more egalitarian society. These people were called the Ikoiki. Now, the Ikoiki had made an absolute mess of things. You could have a samurai who spent their entire life studying the craft of fighting with a sword, fighting with a bow, fighting from atop a horse, equipped with very expensive armor, equipped with very expensive weaponry, and they would ride out into battle against these peasant farmers who, like our founding fathers, would shoot them down in one hit with a week of training. The Ikoiki were a very serious threat to the entire elite of the country. And in the end, their rebellion ends up getting put down. But Tokugawa, he's not going to forget that. He's not going to forget the fact that these people were ever able to rise up in the first place. And so one of his first acts is going to be, everybody, turn in your guns. They collect up all the muskets they can, destroy them. Now you'd think, wouldn't this leave the country vulnerable to invasion? But it doesn't really. Because their neighbors, they really only have two. They have China, who they pay tribute to, and they have Korea, who is also minding its own business. And there's nobody else that they're interacting with. The diplomatic system that Japan existed in and its geographical isolation from the rest of Asia made it possible for the government to do this because the government has no competition. Now, in the short time, the roughly half a century that the Japanese are fighting with muskets, they get to be excellent gunsmiths. At the start, they're buying the muskets, but before long, they're making the muskets themselves. They're improving the muskets. They're creating rifles that have little umbrellas over the flash pan. Well, it's not a flash pan, it's a matchlock, over the match so that they can fire it in the rain. Something that doesn't really come along in the West until like the Civil War era. The Japanese end up in a few decades becoming the #1 firearms manufacturers in the world, and then they just throw it away. And then over time, they forget how to do it. They do this with other things too. Tokugawa has a big concern about peasants moving around. Now, unlike serfs in Europe, serfs in Japan, peasants have essentially no rights. If a samurai wants to kill one, he can. He can kill one for looking at him funny. And they have a big concern, again, about more peasant revolts. So Tokugawa asks, these wheeled conveyances, these wagons that the peasants are always using to, move their crops, their property, move their trade goods, do they really need them? Because the problem with a wagon is that it allows you to move stuff fast. I mean, you could move your house. You could go leave the province you were born in and move somewhere else. And, that would undermine the whole system of serfdom that we have. What would be really scary would be if a lot of people moved to one place and, started planning how to revolt and cut our heads off. And so Tokugawa, in his great wisdom, is going to decide, no wagons. If you need to carry your wares to the market to sell, carry it on your back. Asshole, Nobody needs private transportation. You all should be very, very skeptical of any proposal to limit people's access to private transportation. Because I know of several different cultures that have done it, and never once has it been done for good purposes. The man that wants you to give up your car has evil in his heart, has dark designs on you. Because private transportation is another thing that allows people to live more freely, to have the freedom to move, which ultimately is just as important as the means to express yourself or the means to defend yourself or any other such rights, any other rights that make you a functional person. And in a less dramatic fashion, Japanese manufacturing is also going to regress. Or at best, it stagnates. They've sealed themselves off from the world. Now, there are certain things that they're really good at. They're really good at paper making. They're really good at lacquerware. But there's a lot of things that they're not. They're not good at modern science. They're not good at optics, like making microscopes and telescopes, which is like a big trade good at that time. The Japanese essentially freeze their country. They put it into suspended animation for hundreds of years. And at the same time that they're doing that, the other Asian countries are doing this too. Korea does it, and they call themselves a hermit kingdom. And China's going to do this too. In the case of China, instead of Nagasaki, they're going to trade through Macau with the Portuguese. And Chinese have a big revolt. It brings a new ruler to power. It brings the Ming dynasty to power, casts out the old Yuan Mongol dynasty. And the Ming actually loosen up a lot of internal regulations. But in terms of foreign policy, in a lot of ways, because they were driving out hated invaders, they had a very xenophobic streak. And they also promoted this stuff called Neo-Confucianism. See, in Asia, they have a religion, comes from China, called Confucianism. It's a civil religion. It doesn't preach about the afterlife. It doesn't preach about where the earth comes from, but it preaches about ethics and about ritual. And a big part of Confucianism is that you don't rock the boat. Social stability always comes first. Your duties to your fellow citizens always come first. And they have rules like if your father dies, you have to wait 5 years before you can change anything about the way you farm. Now, how do you think a rule like that is going to affect the pace at which progress can be made? But one of the craziest things that the Ming do is they end up banning ships. Now, earlier in the dynasty, they're actually sending out their treasure fleets. They're sending out these massive ships to go explore the world, to make contact with foreign realms, to conduct trade. And these ships are marvels of engineering. You see in the upper right corner, I have a photo of 2 scale models. The one on the bottom is a Portuguese caravel. That's the model of ship that, the European explorers are using in this same time period. The big one is a Chinese treasure ship. They're like the super cargo carriers that you see on the oceans today. Of course, they're nowhere near as big as one, but like relatively speaking, these are behemoths. And the Chinese are ranging very far. There's this conspiracy theory stuff that they made it to America before the white man did. It's not true, but they're going all the way to Africa. They're going down into Indonesia. They're poking around in their own corner of the world, and they're right on the cusp of getting into the Atlantic. And then suddenly it all stops because the emperor decides, I don't want foreign trade anymore. Not on that scale. Everything that we need, we can make ourselves. Now, that wasn't the decision of the Chinese people. The Chinese people were happy to trade as long as Europeans brought them silver. But the Ming Emperor, he didn't want to deal with the destabilizing impact of European trade and European ideas. He doesn't want the Jesuits poking around any more than the Japanese do. And he doesn't want the kind of social upheaval that new products might cause. And so the Ming ban ships in general. And a nation that could have potentially been one of the big colonizers drops out of the colonization game completely. Now, fast forward several hundred years, And the Europeans, having conquered the Americas, having started to get involved in Africa, they finally come a knocking on East Asia's door. And first, they come a knocking on China's door, wanting to sell them some dope. It's the Opium Wars. The British need tea, and the one product they find that the Chinese really like is opium, a narcotic. Well, understandably, the Chinese government doesn't want to allow foreign dope peddlers. How ironic, given today. And so they cast them out. But the British government goes in, invades the country, sails up their rivers, burns down their palace, forces the door open. And this begins what's called the Century of Humiliation for China. And one of the shocking things about it was how far China had fallen. China actually invents gunpowder weaponry, yet when the British show up to fight the Opium War, the Chinese turn out to fend them off with spears, stick with a knife on the end. They get obliterated. They get knocked on their ass. And they're not able to rise back up again. China had become so poor relative to the rest of the world in its isolation. They had become so backwards technologically in their isolation that they were no longer able to resist even the piddliest of the European powers coming in to knock heads around. And the Europeans never colonized China formally in the sense that they don't annex it, but that's because it's a playground for everyone. There's an understanding among the European powers and the United States that China is like neutral ground. Everyone gets a sphere of influence in it where they get to market their products. They get to have things like extraterritoriality, where if an American commits a crime in China, he gets tried in an American court, not a Chinese one. They get to treat the place like it's a colony without even being responsible for providing government services. And this is going to feed even more instability as you get waves of revolt against this. And the Chinese government gets weaker and weaker and weaker until finally it spectacularly collapses into a several decades long civil war, out of which eventually the communists emerge.